Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to Questions for Corbett. I'm your host, James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and I'm here to answer your questions. And I've got one today from the email bag, specifically from Ben, who writes, "Hi, James. I'm sure you have a million questions, but as a kid who grew up in the 90s, I have to ask, what happened to the anti-establishment people? There used to be so many people that distrusted authorities, no matter what party they were or what side. Where has this gone? And how was it so widely crushed from the bands to the artists to anything cultural? Granted, my perspective is American, but I used to know tons of people who were anti-authoritarian, but now they have joined one of two tribes. From my vantage point, I think this really advanced during the first Trump term, but it probably was in motion much before, and it is smart. Basically, they have set up parameters for someone who is unhappy. It's the Democrats' fault, or it's the Republicans' fault. My question, though, in a nutshell, is what happened to being anti-authoritarian and the default distrust of the authority figures? Excellent question, Ben. Thank you for writing in with this question. I think it's an important one that needs to be addressed, and I will note that I did receive this email shortly before I penned my two-part editorial series that, to some extent, answers this question, but not completely. And I think I have an interesting take on at least a path forward to answering this question that I will present in due time. But first, let's talk about that aforementioned editorial. So for people who don't know, of course, this is CorbettReport.com, and on the front page, well, at the moment that I'm recording this, the top post is the latest editorial. But if you ever want to know about my newsletter editorials, of course, you could just scroll down and here they are. And so here are the latest few. Well, here's the first part and the second part of this series that I'm referring to. Back and to the Right, the pendulum swings again, and From Flatland to Reality, Escaping the Political Pendulum. These are essentially two parts of one long editorial. So if you click into this Back and to the Right, you can get the post. But of course, this is a subscriber newsletter, so please do sign up and become a member if you are not one. However, having said that, you do not need to be a member to read this editorial. You can go read it for free on my Substack. So why don't we go do that? So if you go to my Substack and you go back to the Back and to the Right editorial, which is slipped down to the second page now. Back and to the Right, the pendulum swings again. Here is the full, complete editorial for free. And I did address, essentially, I think, the meat and potatoes of this conundrum that you're referring to here, Ben, in this editorial, specifically in this part on the meaning of anti-establishment, where I write, since the manufacturing of teen culture, link, in the 1950s, and due in no small part to the rise of mass media, link, in the 20th century, Western culture has venerated one particular trope, that of rebellious youths rising up against their stuffy conservative parents. So oft told is the baby boomer coming-of-age tale about a young man or woman defying their parents by growing out their hair, dropping out of college, and joining the anti-war movement, that this narrative cliché now stands, at least in the American popular imagination, as the archetypical story of the 1960s. It's easy to see why this story appealed to the populist sentiment of the time. By tuning in, turning on, and dropping out, the younger generation created a youthquake that shook the establishment to the core. This story of rebellion manifested itself culturally in the veneration of countercultural icons like James Dean, the rebel without a cause, in the rise of protest music, rock and roll, and risque fashion, and in the advent of the pill, the subsequent promotion of free love, and eventually the attendant dissolution of the traditional family structure. Links for those who are interested. But importantly, this renegade spirit also manifested itself politically. Although the tie-dyed, long-haired socks and sandals set eventually put on shirts and ties and joined the workaday world, they would never abandon the political worldview they had adopted during their coming-of-age era. In the US specifically, the boomers' political consciousness, forged in the crucible of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protest movement, associated the term establishment with the conservatives they had opposed in the 1960s, and the term anti-establishment with the left-wing progressives who had marched alongside them. No boomer, in other words, had to be told who the short-haired, yellow-bellied sons of Tricky Dicky were, or on which side of the political aisle those sons were standing. That's why the inversion that has taken place in recent years is so difficult for those of a certain vintage to understand. To them, the establishment has always represented conservative values, and by extension, Republican politicians. in the American context, of course. The anti-establishment has always been populated by progressives, radicals, and activists on the far left wing of the political spectrum. But all that has changed. Do you remember when advocacy of same-sex marriage was an idea too radical even for left-wing politicians? Do you remember when a president having sex with his intern in the Oval Office was dismissed as a trivial issue, though it was perfectly acceptable to shame the intern for the affair? Do you remember when Ace Ventura's over-the-top reaction to his Einhorn discovery was treated as a hilarious joke, rather than an example of insanely transphobic movie-making deserving of a re-evaluation? For all those who answered yes to the above questions, keep in mind that there's an entire generation growing up today who don't remember those things. For the Gen Zers, and now the Gen Alphas, there has never been a time when the establishment, from the politicians running the country, to the media figures and celebrities appearing on their screens, to the teachers at their schools, to the corporations plying them with products, has been opposed to those ideas once considered so radical and progressive. Of course the Biden administration appointed a dog role-playing fetishist to a top position in the Office of Nuclear Energy before firing them for repeatedly stealing luggage at airports. And if you think that's odd, you're a bigot who deserves to be cast out of polite society. Of course teachers spend their days at school casually wishing death on conservative Christians, and if you don't think the teacher is the real victim here, then you're probably one of those bitter clingers who deserve to die. Of course Gillette made ads insulting their own customers for their supposed toxic masculinity, and of course Bud Light partnered with a transgender influencer to market their beer, and of course Lockheed Martin sponsors Pride Month events. And how dare you question the virtue of their public advocacy? Yes, for as long as today's younger generation can remember, the establishment has been synonymous with identity politics and woke virtue signaling. It doesn't take a genius, then, to figure out that for this generation, being anti-establishment means living the baby boomers' coming-of-age tale in reverse. That is, cutting their hair short, dressing in suits, rejecting free love, and going to church. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what's been happening in recent years. In fact, not only do Gen Zers self-identify as more conservative than previous generational cohorts, they are also, according to some overzealous clickbait headline writers, possibly the most conservative generation in history. The old truism that children are always more progressive and left-leaning than their parents, it turns out, isn't an ironclad law of the universe, as generations of people in the West have come to assume. Naturally, this political shift is manifesting itself in every aspect of society and culture. Gen Zers are having less sex than previous generations, and are even less interested in seeing sex depicted in movies. Gen Zers are repopularizing traditional gender roles and family dynamics, with Gen Z men gravitating to the manosphere, and Gen Z women embracing the trad wife lifestyle. Even religion is reasserting itself, with Gen Zers half as likely as their parents to call themselves atheists, and young men converting to Orthodox Christianity in record numbers. There is one simple way to contextualize these sweeping changes. We can relate them to the swing of the political pendulum. The political world had swung so far to the left that a swing back to the right was inevitable, and that is exactly what we're seeing now. From this viewpoint, there's a strange mirror image similarity between the hippies, the extreme countercultural elements of the 1960s, and the tiki torch-bearing white identitarians and Nazi flag-waving extreme countercultural elements of Gen Z. They are both defying political convention in ways that are sure to shock their parents' generation. But if we stop our analysis here, we run the risk of assuming we're merely living through some generational cycle that has always existed and will always continue to exist for the rest of human history. As it turns out, the pendulum swing from left to right and back again does not adequately describe our political reality. To truly understand what is happening, we need to think outside the box. Or should that be outside the spectrum? ... I will leave this dramatic reading of my editorial there. You, of course, can go and read that on your own time in its full context. And then, of course, you can read the second part of this editorial in which I describe in more detail what escaping the political pendulum or the political spectrum means and how we can envision something that is not quite as simply one-dimensional as the political spectrum that we are told comprises the totality of the political universe. But having said that, I think you're starting to understand at least one aspect of an answer to a question like Ben's. What happened to anti-establishment? Well, to a certain extent, the conceptualization of even what the establishment is and how anti-establishmentarianism manifests itself in our current age has changed. The very concept of what it means to be against the establishment, I suppose, in a general sense, it's the same, but in the specific sense, it's a mirror image. It's the exact opposite of what it was, say, in the 1960s or in previous generations, even in the 1990s, when I remember, for example, Nirvana's downplaying of macho, swaggering, traditional rock star imagery and embracing Kurt wearing dresses on stage and things like that was still transgressive. That was anti-establishment and countercultural at the time. Fast forward a few years, and that is the establishment. That is what is expected. You better at least embrace and celebrate people who go on stage with the dress, or else you're some sort of horrible bigot, and that has become the establishment narrative. So what does it mean to be anti-establishment at a time when what was anti-establishment just a couple of decades ago is the inverse of what it was now? So you see, that complicates the question of anti-establishmentarianism. But, Ben, I think you're right to ask, where does this really come from? Where does this impetus of dividing everything into the left-right political spectrum, and even more specifically than that, specifically the culture war issues, so that one's entire, not just political identity, but entire identity is defined by one's position on the spectrum between woke and MAGA? And that's it. Where did that division really start to come into play? And how does that affect that conception that used to exist in previous generations that the anti-establishment was at least aiming upward rather than at each other? When did it become this absolute, total, binary, polarizing division of society? I think there is an answer to that, and I posited at least where I would identify that juncture in history where we started to go down this path in my recent conversation with John Titus about his new documentary series on the war for bankocracy. I think there is an incredibly fascinating history of the past 15 years that can and should, and maybe I'll write it myself, but should be written on the cultural history of the past 15 years and the woke culture, identity, culture war nonsense that has absolutely subsumed every other political story is a result of that 2008 backlash that you're talking about, which gave rise to two populist movements, one on the right, the Tea Party, one on the left, the Occupy movement. And both of those completely subsumed into this culture war nonsense that has totally diverted it from the fact that, hey, it seems that people on the left and the right totally agree on this against the bankers and against Wall Street. Wow. Now that's all gone. It's all been shoved under the rug and no one even remembers the 2008 bailout.
I remember because I was making a movie. I was making a movie called Bailout. At that time, I went to a lot of those Occupy Wall Street protests. They didn't look anything like what the media said they did. I was at these protests. There was a lot of people who were older and a lot of people were having conversations exactly like you just said, like, hey, you know what? I may be lefty, but the Ron Paul people are making sense. And the Ron Paul people are like, hey, those guys make sense. And they were getting together. And the powers that be had to put that to a stop as soon as they could. They got together and they did it.
Once again, that was a clip from my recent interview with John Titus about his new documentary series, The War for Bankocracy, which is available for viewing right now at Solari.com. The first two episodes have been posted as I record this QFC. So if you haven't seen that interview, what are you doing? The link is in the show notes. Please do listen to that conversation in its entirety. If you haven't yet seen Titus's series, start watching. It is worth your time. Having said that, I am not going to presume today in this edition of Questions for Corbett to do that deep dive history that I think deserves to be done on specifically that post-2008 global financial crisis moment that I identify there as the moment where a true, real, grassroots, widespread, anti-establishment populist movement started to come together spontaneously, but was very deliberately driven apart with a gigantic wedge. And I think that is the moment that we can see, at least in this time frame, in the 21st century. This is how the divide and conquer game has been affected to bring about exactly what you talk about there in your question, Ben. Well, now everybody is on one of two camps, and you either support this side of the government or you support that side of the government. But nobody is against the idea of government. Well, whoa, what happened? Well, how did that happen? Oh, well, at least we can identify when and where and for what reasons that was brought about. But here's the even more interesting, fascinating question. How was that brought about? As I say, I'm not doing the deep dive on that today, but I do at least have the start of that trail that I think is incredibly important, incredibly interesting, and starts in an incredibly unusual place with a seemingly disconnected observation.
So I want you to think for a second about how you talk about time these days, how you describe the era that we live in. You might call it the post-pandemic era, or maybe the second Trump administration. Or, as I overheard someone say in LA recently, you might say we're entering our fire era. Bleak. But you know, we used to have a different way to talk about the passage of time that was pervasive in our society. Up until about 20 years ago, we described the passage of time purely in 10-year chunks called decades. Remember those? The roaring 20s, the swinging 60s, and the no soup for you 90s. You know, it's difficult to overstate how much we structured our entire culture around these specific 10-year chunks. But I don't have to state it at all because you know it already intuitively. If I were to tell you to close your eyes and picture the 70s, you'd instantly think bell bottoms, big lapels, and John Travolta staying alive. If I asked you what the 40s sounded like, you can hear a big swing band in your mind. And if I say the word 90s, you can practically see the Saved by the Bell intro, feel the snap bracelet around your wrist, taste the Arch Deluxe, hear Blur's Song 2, and smell the sickly sweet aroma of Bed Bath & Beyond. The bundle of concepts associated with each decade feels so distinct and meaningful that just the name of a decade evokes a world of associations with that time period. And up until the late 90s, we used these decade names almost constantly in everyday speech to describe not just the past, but the present.
Wake up and smell the 90s.
Come on, Uncle Phil, this is the 90s, man.
Man, it's the 90s. It's hammer time. Come on.
I can be anything I want to be. It's the 90s.
Honey, it's the 90s, remember? Microchips, microwaves, faxes, airphones.
For God's sake, Chucky, drag yourself into the 90s.
I mean, the 90s were such an enormous, omnipresent concept that even sentient axe-murdering dolls understood they had to get with the times. The phrase was a cultural shorthand for this pervasive feeling that the world was new and advancing, and that the old norms of the past were being swept away. The passage from the 80s to the 90s was seen as this literal cultural vibe shift. But then, 10 years later, something happened that made the vibes suddenly stop shifting.
Now, that was a clip from someone called Adam Conover from a video entitled What Happened to Decades. And full caveat up front, I have absolutely no idea who Adam Conover is, and I am certainly not making some sort of blanket recommendation. But that video in particular, I would argue, is worth your time and attention. So the link will be in the show notes. Please follow it through. Please watch that full video, because Adam Conover makes a very basic, almost trivial observation, but shows how it is connected to a profound disconnect that has happened in our society as a result of our language. And I will spoil, I suppose, some of his argument here by noting that he goes on to explain the observation that I'm sure we've all had at some point. We have stopped referring to decadal units as decades since the turn of the 21st century. And why? Because there is no good, handy, shorthand way to say the decade's name in English. 70s, 80s, 90s, zero, double zero, aughts, noughties. No one could agree on what to call each decade. So, let's just stop referring to decades. And that, of course, carried over into the 2010s. You can't call them the 20-teens, the 2010s. Again, that's not a decade. We're now in the 20s. But if I say 20s, you're not going to think 2020s. You're going to think 1920s, because we have so thoroughly become disconnected from that cultural convention of referring to decades of time that we don't have any connection with that anymore. It's the 20s? What does that even mean? What does the 20s conjure in your imagination? Now, again, that's seemingly a trivial observation. Okay, it seems to be true, but so what? Who cares? What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Well, let me tell you what that has to do with the price of tea in China. As Adam Conover goes on to state, we have replaced thinking about time in chunks of decades that everyone in the 90s was in the 90s. It's the 90s. It's hammer time. Whatever you associate with that decade was associated with everyone. And as he goes on to point out, for example, 90s nostalgia, like the wedding singer looking back at the 80s, everyone could look back at the fashion that was taking place 10 years ago, and everyone could say, that was crazy. Wow, remember when we all did that? Oh. But since we no longer refer to decades as these cultural units, now we've replaced that by talking about generations. Now we talk about millennial fashion, or we talk about Gen Zers slang, for example. There is no 2010s, there is no 2020s. There are generational units. And precisely because of that shift in language, our society has instantly become stratified, disconnected by generational age cohort. Now, not everyone participates in a certain fashion style or musical trend or what have you. No, now that is associated with a particular generation by its very nomenclature. So that if I'm not a millennial, which I'm not, how can I possibly have anything to do with that millennial fashion or the millennial whoop or any of these other things that are now being associated with generational cohorts? And what does that end up doing? Now it's not a shared cultural feeling that we're in the 70s. This is the 80s. We're in the 90s. Now it's this generation does this thing. This generation does the other thing. And instantly we are divided amongst ourselves. Are you starting to get where this is going and how this relates to the establishment conversation? Because I would posit there has been a similar, I think probably embedded, nomenclature shift in the language, whereby we now no longer talk about establishment and anti-establishment, culture and counterculture. Those terms are being drummed out of us, and if it weren't for old fuddy-duddies like me, I don't know if anyone would be talking about it, or people like Ben, who admits he was a child of the 90s, so he's probably getting a few gray hairs by this point as well. But do younger people talk about the establishment, the anti-establishment, culture, counterculture? Are those concepts still linguistically present in our society? I would argue, well, certainly not to the extent that they were, for example, back, as I was talking about in my editorial in the 60s. And you will note, in my editorial, I talked about generational cohorts. It was the boomers, and it's the Gen Zers. It's not decades of time in which we are all taking place in a big cultural stew. No, it is specific generational age cohorts that are manifesting in certain specific identifiable ways. And if you're in that age cohort, you're that person. You're a Gen Zer. You're a millennial. You're a Xer. You're a boomer. Okay, so where does this go? What can we see taking place as a result of this change that is happening, where establishment, the concept of establishment, is no longer in our lexicon? Now, let me point to a specific example of that, something you can put your finger on. When was the last time you heard anyone, even ironically or jokingly, refer to the man? I mean, even by, I suppose, the 90s, when I was also growing up, I could certainly remember that the man, stop oppressing me, you're the man, was a joke, because it had become such a dated cultural reference to the 1960s boomer era, hippie movement of the anti-establishment at that time, protesting the man. Well, it had become kind of a cultural joke by then. I don't think it even exists anymore. If you said that to a Gen Zer, would they even know what the man is supposed to mean? Would they even get that even if you used it ironically, would they even get it's a joke? The man has been removed from the lexicon. Now, again, trivial, minor observation. Who cares? Words come and go, and some things, slang changes all the time. Okay, but it's not just the man. It is also the establishment, or if we wanted to go with Eisenhower's formulation, the military-industrial complex, which was a wonderful phrase that Eisenhower seeded into the English language and into our popular cultural lexicon that helped generations of people understand a thing that exists, that is real, that had no name. There was no concept for it until military-industrial complex. Oh, suddenly I understand this thing exists, and I see how it's related, and I understand how it influences. Okay, now I can do research, and I can start thinking about it. But if that word doesn't exist, how do you situate yourself within that? Who talks about the military-industrial complex anymore? That's, again, outdated. Besides, those establishment, military-industrial complex, that is just the man in a tuxedo. So, Here is my radical idea as a stopgap measure until we do the deep dive Corbett-style exploration of the history of how we've reached this cultural moment of complete polarization. In the meantime, here's my radical suggestion. I think we need to bring back the man. I think we need to start using that phrase again to identify who are the real oppressors, who are the people who are truly oppressing all of us, whether the woke hipster libtards or the red hat wearing MAGAs, because those are the only two types of people who exist in the world anymore, apparently. They're all in the same boat, and they're all fighting the same people. But if you don't have a word to describe the people that you are fighting, you're going to start fighting each other. No. My enemy? No, it's DEI is my enemy. Woke transgender bathrooms, that's my enemy. Or, oh, these fascists with their red hats, that's my enemy. No. The enemy, look up, guys. Why do you keep looking left and right? Look up. There's the enemy, the oligarchs, the establishment, the man. We need to, hey, maybe it doesn't have to be the man. That's probably not going to catch on. But we need a word to identify the oligarchs who exist in every era of human history, our era not excluded, and that is not simply on one side or the other of a political aisle. If you are still thinking in the straight line, one-dimensional spectrum of allowable political thought, you are not thinking about these problems deeply enough, and if you do not have the words to describe the, at the very least, two-dimensional reality, oh my god, we can imagine a second dimension to politics that involves an up and a down, not just left and right. And suddenly, wow, maybe we can develop some language to talk about the people who are up there in the positions of power at the top of the power pyramid oppressing us. The man. And suddenly we have words to describe these people. You know what? I think I get it. I'm starting to understand how this works. Okay, so, Donald Trump. He's the man. Yeah, I get it. Or Elon Musk. Elon Musk is the man. Gavin Newsom is the man. George Soros is the man. Nancy Pelosi is the man? The woo man. I don't know what you'd say to that. Peter Thiel is the man. Hillary Clinton is the man. Larry Ellison is the man. Bill Gates is the man. John Ratcliffe is the man. Anyway, we can start to identify the man. And then we can actually have an anti-establishment again. Because all these critters who are infesting all of these technocratic, bureaucratic positions of power and trying to rule over the people for their wealth and benefit and at our expense, they are the man. We are not the man. James Corbett is not the man. I'm not sitting there oppressing you from some position of power. I am not your enemy. Even if you disagree with all my political opinions, I'm not your enemy. Look up. Same thing with dear anonymous internet user 735Q/8B1. who is listening to my voice right now. You're not the man. I know you are not the man. I don't care what your political opinions are, actually. I know you are not the enemy. I'm concentrating on the people who are actually oppressing us. I am concentrating on the man. So there is at least the start of the answer to your question, Ben. I think, yes, you're right to identify that there has been a shift over the past few decades, not the past generation, that has taken place, that has certainly resulted in this situation where who is against authoritarian establishment politics anymore? No, everyone's for the authoritarian establishment politicians. It's just, which one are you for? What happened to the anti-establishment? What happened to the countercultural movement? It lost its very vocabulary for describing the position that we are in. It lost the man. Anyway, that's my observation for today. Thank you very much for a very interesting question, Ben. And I hope this answer at least gets people's thinking caps on and gets them pondering. And hey, if there's a linguist in the crowd who has a catchy slogan that will catch on more than the man, be my guest. Run with it. And I will start using whatever wonderful catchphrase you come up with. But I think we do need one. Anyway, that's my observation for today. James Corbett, CorbettReport.com. Thank you for investing your mind time in the Corbett Report. I'm looking forward to talking to you again in the near future.